If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers, to an intriguing episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. My guest on today's episode is Robert Meyers, retired longtime journalist, former worker for the Washington Post, and current president emeritus of the National Press Foundation, as well as a new incoming board member of the Shake-Speare Oxford Fellowship. Bob, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Bob, it's so good to have someone of your stature and experience from the field of journalism to discuss this issue of the Shakespeare authorship question and the Oxfordian theory, because, in my personal mind, I believe that your experience lends a great deal of credibility to the intellect with which you have brought to your personal pursuit of this question and the reporter's mind, as it were. Myself being a former journalist, I understand a little bit about that. I don't have the illustrious history and experience that you have as a journalist, but I understand a little bit about that, and I wanted to talk about that and make that sort of the feature of today's program.
Well, thank you for all the unnecessary compliments, but I'll take them anyway. I think the way the mind works is that some things make sense and other things don't make sense. And I was a kid who in junior high and high school really loved Shakespeare. At the time, I thought that I was going to be involved in theater. I thought that I would be a stage director. And for our high school drama club, I staged sword fights and scenes from Romeo and Juliet, and from Henry V, the wooing scene between Prince Hal and Catherine. The thing was, I never believed the story of Shakespeare. Now, I want to be clear that I didn't have an alternative candidate, and that I was skeptical about the authorship question. I just didn't believe it. And I thought that there must have been one guy, and he was from the sleepy town of Stratford, and he did all this stuff. But the biography we had of him made no sense to me. And so I thought that the author was some other guy about whom we knew nothing. And that was how I went really through high school and through college.
When you were in high school and college, did you ever have those discussions with anybody in the realm of English literature, whether it was an English teacher from high school or a literature professor in college or anything like that?
No. No, I mean, we would study the plays, and when you're in college, you're doing all you can to keep up. And the idea of introducing a candidate who was sort of unknown. Well, first, I didn't know much. I didn't know anything about Oxford really until well after college. But it just made no sense to me. But a point I want to make here is that to sort of support something you said at the beginning of the talk, journalists are curious, and they are in the best sense, skeptical. They want to see things proven. You can't just say the moon is made of blue cheese. They want to see it, and I wanted to find out who wrote the plays, and the poems, especially the sonnets. And the more you looked at that question, the sketchier it became. I mean, this was a guy who was astonishingly well educated, but there was no proof that he went to the local grammar school or any other school. He knew an astonishing amount about law, but there are no records of someone with his name attending the inns of court, the places where lawyers were trained. But more importantly to me, you can't go from a history class where you're learning that that England at the time, during the reign of Elizabeth, was just coming out of a very brutal medieval period. Somebody like Walsingham had spies everywhere. There was intrigue. People lost their heads, and you couldn't really advance in society unless you had been well-born, high-born. Those were all phrases that were used at the time. And Shakespeare had none of that. His father was a grain grower, a merchant, maybe a glove maker. He had minor skirmishes with the law. He seems to have been illiterate. And then suddenly in this semi-closed society, Will Shakespeare sort of arises and knows all these people and writes about nobles in a way that, should have gotten him bumped off. And didn't.
To say the least.
Yeah. And so the question was why? And I think that's the repertorial approach. The question is why? Why do things happen? How does somebody do this? And that has always been the approach that I've taken to this subject.
Well, so you mentioned that it wasn't until after college that Oxford was introduced to you in some way. How did that happen? How did you meet the Earl of Oxford for the first time?
So I graduated from UCLA in '65. I was living in a small apartment in West Hollywood. I believe that there was a book review or some sort of an excerpt from the Ogborn's book, The Man Who Was Shakespeare, or something like that.
The mysterious William Shakespeare,
yeah.
Charles.
And
Charlton
it made
Ogborn?
sense. It suddenly made sense. Now, on my own, during this period, I had gone back to the UCLA Graduate Library, and I had looked up Bacon and Marlowe, because those were the names you frequently heard as possible authorship candidates. And neither one really fit the bill to my way of looking at it. I mean, Bacon was quite scholarly, quite lawyerly, for all of the passion and the romance and the great sense of pageantry. He just wasn't that guy. Marlowe had the sense of pageantry, but he had a level of anger, and he had, I think, a kind of a level of hostility, and the words didn't make much sense to me. I mean, that is to say, his language didn't rise to the level of Shakespeare. So, after college, I was sort of living with the idea that whoever the author is, it ain't this guy. It ain't the guy from Stratford. And in my opinion, it wasn't Marlowe, and it wasn't Bacon. Then the Ogborn works came around, and that made an enormous amount of sense to me. And I think it was like an excerpt either in the New York Times or maybe it was Atlantic or Harper's that excerpted his book. But one of those places also had a reference to William Shakespeare identified as Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, the book by Thomas Looney, the school teacher.
Yes.
And I went up to a used bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard, and they had a copy of the book.
No kidding.
Third edition. I bought it. It couldn't have been much money because I didn't have much money.
I was going to ask you, were you working in journalism at the time yet, or no? You were just
I had
just out of
not yet. I was sort of doing my self-designed apprenticeship. I had given myself 5 years from the time I graduated from school to learn how to write, and by that I mean I took lots of odd jobs. I was a book clerk. I was a gopher on a motion picture. That was to say, go for this, go for that, get the director coffee. I worked as an assistant on industrial training films. And I I sold encyclopedias. That was the first great failure of my life. I spent 3 months trying to sell the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I finally sold a set.
I had a set. I'm old enough to remember that was our Google when I was a kid.
Yeah, but then when I did the numbers, it had taken me 3 months to sell one set, and I had a $90 commission, and that didn't make any sense at all. So even I, mathematically illiterate as I am, realized I was never going to be a great salesman. So I went and did other things. But always I would write. I would write 5 or 8 hours a day, probably 6 days a week. And I would write short stories, and I wrote several novels. And I would mimic journalists, usually for the LA Times, who were covering events that I was familiar with, to see how well I could imitate what they were doing. And in 1970, having basically run out of money completely, a friend whom I'm still in touch with got me a job or introduced me to the bureau chief at Newsweek magazine in Los Angeles. And he was looking for cheap labor, which a stringer always is. And so he gave me a number of assignments. And that started my journalism career in 1970. So that's 50 years ago. So
to be a Stratfordian advocate, one could argue these odd jobs, these things you did along the way that helped train you to become a writer, propelled you into what became a lifelong career as a very highly respected and illustrious journalist. So why couldn't that have been true about William Shakespeare of Stratford?
Different society. If I were taken back to the Elizabethan era, I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have had a sense of the history, which often was family history and not written down or passed down. I might not have. I certainly couldn't have read the books in French and Greek and Latin and Italian that the author clearly had read. I mean, this has nothing. This is the genius theory. Well, Shakespeare was such a genius, he could do everything. Well, no, not exactly. You couldn't travel in Elizabethan England without the Queen's permission. So how does Shakespeare know all about the stuff going on in Italy, and very specifically at the Doge's Palace and in Mantua. So the analogy just doesn't hold. I mean, the greatest geniuses are defined and limited and sometimes inspired by their time. And whatever else I was not such a genius that I could intuitively understand books written in languages I'd never studied. But I can tell you that the idea of thinking inquisitively about something is a trait that journalists have. And I think that helped me in my early days when you go around and you meet people, and you need to figure out very quickly what it is they're doing, and you need to get a lot of stuff right. You need to get everything right. So I did that, and at the time I was a stringer for Newsweek, and then I was a stringer for the Washington Post during the Watergate investigations, which had a lot to do with the West Coast. And
wow, that's a whole separate podcast episode right there for a whole nother program. That I would love to talk to you about all of that someday.
Well, I can't say anything as witty as, well, I always had my copy of the Earl of Oxford with me when I was trying to figure out the who had started the Dirty Tricks campaign to sabotage Hubert Humphrey's campaign. But I can tell you, looking skeptically at the question of political malfeasance is certainly helpful today, but it takes a lot of effort to say, wait a minute, 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't equal 45. So let's try and figure this out. And I think that's the essence of what journalism is.
I would say, I spent some time, you worked for the Post. I worked for the Redlands Daily Fax at one point in my life. Was the largest newspaper that I worked for. It was part of a greater conglomerate of newspapers. So once in a while, one of those sister papers in a larger market would lift one of my stories, and I'd get very excited when my story might show up in the LA Daily News. But I did work for multiple different editors throughout my career as a journalist, and I know that the best editors that I worked for and the ones who taught me the most about journalism were the ones that were the sticklers, the ones that would send a story back and say, you need to get another source on this. You need to corroborate this statement. You need to rewrite this section because this is not going to fly on the pages of my paper. And I think that there's a certain level of that you would then have to bring to your inquiry into the Shakespeare authorship question.
Well, to me, sure. I mean, to me, saying that Shakespeare just intuitively knew Italian, or Shakespeare knew all the myths and the fairy tales that go into A Midsummer Night's Dream. Okay, they're in the play, but how do they get in the play? And where were the original works, or how did the author find out about it? And I think if you keep asking that question, you come up with the idea, well, wait a minute, maybe this is a guy who's kind of special, who's really smart, who really can learn languages, who could get the Queen's permission to travel outside the country. And, I mean, the remarkable thing about Shakespeare is that he is virtually the only author in the modern world. And by modern, I mean from the Greeks to this day, whose biography doesn't match his work and whose work doesn't match his biography. I mean, you have to go back to Homer, who may have been a composite of a whole bunch of writers. To find another author of such amazing versatility and scope and breadth of language as Shakespeare had. I mean, we know stuff about Aeschylus. We know stuff about Euripides. What do we know about Shakespeare? Nobody sees him in Stratford or in London, where he supposedly went, dumping his wife and 3 children, and yet writing such beautiful lines about love and creating such astonishing female characters. We don't know anything about him, and so you've got this astonishing author and a biography that simply doesn't fit. And the easy way out for Stratfordians is to say, well, he was a genius and he could do all of this because geniuses can do all that stuff. Well, genius like that works with Einstein, where you have numbers and you have concepts that can be developed. But when you're trying to describe human emotions, when you're trying to describe interactions, but by the way, most people in the British society didn't know about because they were things that involved only nobility. When you see that, you have to say, okay, so maybe this is a made-up story. And I don't know why it's a made-up story, but maybe I need to now go learn more about history.
I always love the Einstein reference, and that's one that oftentimes Stratfordians will bring up because they'll talk about how Einstein came from these humble beginnings, a poor family. He didn't have wealth or nobility on his side. And so see what genius can do from nowhere. And why are you elitists trying to say that genius can't begin from humble beginnings and become greatness? The problem is after age 10, Einstein's comparison with Shake-Speare of Stratford ends, and his comparison with Edward de Vere begins, because that's when Einstein suddenly has access to great mentors, great tutors, magnificent libraries, scholarship, universities. Like when you look at Einstein's life, sure, the first 10 years, he's just a poor Jewish boy. And then bang, he gets access to these wonderful minds who foster his genius and thrust him to where he ends up.
No argument for me. And I think, in fact, that you can take a look at the tutors that Oxford had and say these were some of the leading scholars and tutors of the time. What he picked up from them was simply astonishing. But that's a different kind of brain functioning than the scientific approach that Einstein had and that others tutored him in.
But wouldn't you agree? I mean, you must have in your career, you must have had, whether they were editors or fellow journalists in your lifetime, who you looked to as mentors in your trade. And what I've always found, I've been very fortunate that I've had mentors in my life who I have great appreciation and affinity for. And that's not for me to go, I'm a genius and that's why these mentors wanted to be my mentor. But what I find in my life and what I have to believe happened in Shakespeare's life and what obviously happened in Einstein's life was there were mentors who came along and saw the potential. And that's why they wanted to help that potential become all it could be. One of the greatest stories ever in the history of mankind is Aristotle seeing what Alexander could be and tutoring him to take over the known world.
It's a great story. You asked me if I've had mentors like that in my life, and unfortunately, no. I had some good editors who pointed me in the right direction for things. I worked with some great reporters, but I'll give you an example that maybe is not quite the refutation of what you're suggesting. Some point after I learned of Oxford and started doing research into it, I joined one of the predecessor groups to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and I think it was called the Shakespeare Oxford Alliance or SAS or something like that. It was basically American based, and they had a small number of people were members and had a connection to a sister group in England that had been founded several years after the publication of Shakespeare Identified, published 1920. This group was founded 1922, and so it's now 1972. That English group is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and by coincidence, I'm working in Washington on a 3-month stint in a senator's office, and decided to attend the 50th anniversary of the Shakespeare Oxford, or the Shakespearean Authorship Society. I think that's what it was called. There I met two people whose work really did influence my life, and who were very, very generous to me. And it was Ruth Lloyd Miller and her husband, Judge Minos Miller. And their daughter, of course, is Bonner Miller Cunning.
She's been a guest on this program several times. She's one of our favorite guests,
and is a great scholar in her own right. Well, Mrs. Miller sent me her famous set of purple covered books, which just have so much information in them, and I've schlepped them around the world with me. They're sitting behind me right now on my shelf. But she was very encouraging, and that helped me to sustain myself in my Oxford studies. I was just there for a couple of weeks, but it was sort of a lifelong, impactful event. So that was quite fortuitous.
Well, you don't get much better pedigree than that, as far as once you've discovered Oxford and you want to know more, to suddenly find yourself in the presence of the Millers. That would be a pretty exciting thing for most of us.
Not a bad crowd to be in.
Not a bad crowd to be in, not at all. But, one of the great privileges that I have is that I'm in such a magnificent crowd of all of you who have been guests on this program, and the great scholars that I get to speak to week after week about this topic and the various angles of it and the various approaches to their scholarship. And you are a very unique guest, though, because you coming from an angle of, as you said, curiosity and inquiry and trying to discover the truth of the story more so than the scholarship of the facts. And that, I think, is going to be intriguing to our listeners who are listening right now.
I had an anthropology professor at UCLA who had a famous line that he used to give to students. I'll clean it up for the sake of this broadcast. But no, we don't have any censors. You're okay. You can tell us. Tell us how it goes. He would say, this is primitive peoples today, in effect. He would say, it may not matter to you how many feathers the such and such tribe stick up their you-know-what, but it matters to them, and you need to know it if you are going to do well in this subject. And I've always remembered that because it says that you, the individual, are not as important as understanding the situation, as learning something about the other person, which I have always believed is sort of the best way you can honor them, is to learn about them. And to me, learning about the author of the plays and the poems and the sonnets is a way to honor his life. And it's also a way to improve your own life, because, if if you believe that a kid from the country whose parents were illiterate, whose children were illiterate, who never referred to himself as a writer, who was never referred to as a writer during his lifetime, if you think that guy wrote the 37 or 38 plays and the 154 sonnets and the long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, if you think that that's the characteristic of the author, I got a bridge in Brooklyn I can get for you cheap. So,
you don't live anywhere near Brooklyn.
Well, listen, they got bridges all over, Steve, and I can find one. I can find one that is really perfect for you.
All right, you'll find a bridge. Where I live in Southern Oregon, we have a couple of different rivers. In fact, one of the school districts here is called Three Rivers because we have three major rivers here nearby. And there's a spot upriver from my home, up the Applegate River from my home, where they built a modern highway bridge. And they left the old suspension bridge that used to serve as the highway. And it's now become a roost for ospreys. The ospreys like to nest up there. So there's one. I could offer that one for sale probably to somebody.
Well, no, I want to sell it to you. See, I actually own that bridge.
Oh, you do?
and I can really make you a good deal on it in just the same way that the promoters of the Shake-Speare Theater, Shake-Speare person, have convinced people of something that I think simply isn't true. Was there a guy named Shakespeare? Yeah, probably. Was he involved in the theater? He may have been a kind of a script runner. He may have been an extra. But he wrote the plays. You know, when I was in high school, to make it work, the teachers would say that after messing around with learning how to write, he would write. He had this astonishing facility, and he wrote 2 to 3 of the world's greatest plays every year. And he did that for 9 or 10 years. And then he quit, and then went back to Stratford, and he was hauling hay and charging people interest. That is another part of the story that makes no sense. If you are at the height of your powers, you may quit simply to and rest on your laurels, but you don't go back to an intellectually stultifying farm and say, okay, I did it, and now I'm done. It doesn't happen.
How does the way. Well? That's a great point, because he goes back, and then you have these legal documents that we do know exist that are the truth of the man Shake-Speare from Stratford, where he's suing people over grain, and he's suing people over property, and he's lending money and charging people interest for what he's lending. How does the guy who writes a play about the evils of usury go back to a life of usury after he has, quote unquote, retired from writing. And of course, I'm talking about The Merchant of Venice, which is such a profound play. And how do you create those stories, that character, and then go become the Shylock that you have so villainized in your play?
Well, if you're looking to me for an answer, the answer is the boy from Stratford didn't write them.
Of course.
And the idea that he did is sort of part of this, what Coleridge called the willing suspension of disbelief, that you can make these switches. Somebody on the website of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship once said, "Where is the tragedy of the glove merchant? Where is the comedy of holding horses in front of a theater?" I mean, we know nothing about this guy, and yet he's supposed to have known everything about everybody else. It makes no sense, and I think it really diminishes the understanding of human endeavor to sort of say, okay, I've written all these plays, and now I'm going back home, and I'll cheat people out of a few pounds.
When you worked as a journalist, did you ever have any of these discussions with your fellow journalists? Did you ever run into problems with people learning that you had these aberrant, subversive views about the author of the Shakespearean canon?
No, I mean, no.
No.
I mean, I would go to the plays. There's a wonderful a series of theaters in Washington that put on plays, and I would go to the plays. I would go to the movies, but you can start to look like a somebody who's a bit whacked out if at the first drop of the word Shakespeare you say, oh well, he didn't write the plays. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote I was a couple of years ago I was talking with my primary care doctor, and I was about to retire, and she was asking me what I was going to do, and I said, well, I've got a hobby. At the time I was working on glass, and I said I'll probably continue to develop my interest in the Shakespeare authorship question. And she looked at me and she said, I didn't know there was a question. Well, needless to say, that's an opportunity.
Yes, it is.
To educate someone. But those opportunities against someone who's willing to consider something they don't know, which is part of the magic of medicine, that was an opportunity I didn't stumble on. I'll tell you something else. My wife and I were on a vacation a couple of years ago, maybe longer ago than that, 5 to 10 years ago. And I forget where we were, and I had brought with me Rowe's book, Shakespeare's Guide to Italy.
Yes. Yes, great book.
Yeah, it is a great book. And my wife had finished reading all the books that she'd bought, and I hadn't yet gotten to Shakespeare's Guide to Italy. So she asked if she could read it because she had nothing to read, and I guess where we were, they didn't have books. And we've been married a long time, and she knows and knew of my interest, and but she was not in any way a convert or, frankly, all that interested. And she read Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, and she said, "Well, I'm an Oxfordian." So, it takes something like that for someone to think about it and to start understanding the the astonishing intellect and the astonishing um, substance matter that is in each of the plays, in each of the poems, and that they relate to real life. It's not just fantasy time. But that's one of our big challenges as Oxfordians is how do we educate other people in a way that will stick.
Well, it's true. It's becoming one of the things that's, I think, making it more and more difficult is that, we live in a 140 character society where everything is tweets and posts and memes and headlines, and nobody wants to actually take the time to read the research, read the stories, read the books. And so, unfortunately, part of the hurdle is that we've gone into this sort of societal culture that is, lowest common denominator way of communicating with people, and that's an unfortunate thing that is, I think, hampering the Oxfordian movement in a lot of ways. But it's nice that we have this forum, this audio forum, because people oftentimes are stuck in a car, or they're in a commuter situation, or they like to run for a jog or a run, and so they'll download shows like this one and they'll pop them on, and they'll hear some things and they'll understand things better through the conversations that we have here on the program. And hopefully we encourage some of them to pick up some of those books. And Richard Rowe's book is one of the easiest reads too. I think of all the Oxfordian literature, it's such an easy read. And it truly is a magnificent book in the sense that I don't think he ever mentions Oxford once in the entire book.
No, he doesn't. He only refers to the author of the play.
Right. He just points out that the guy who wrote these plays visited these places, and here's how we know, because he got the details perfect. And my wife and I've mentioned this on the program before, my wife and I have long wanted to take the Oxford tour of Italy. And twice in our lives now, we have had the whole thing planned and mapped out. And twice we've had to cancel the trip. I told her the other day, I said, maybe this is the time. Maybe now we can actually take that trip to Italy. Nobody else is going there. Maybe it'll be really cheap too. So
just take a mask.
Yeah, just wear a mask. But we're looking into it because it is something that is definitely on my bucket list. I want to bring Rowe's book and have it under my arm and visit those locations and look at the things that the author saw when he then recorded them for all posterity in the plays that he wrote.
Yeah, that'd be a great trip.
You haven't done it?
No, I've in terms of Oxford, obviously on this trip to London in '72, we went to Castle Hedingham. We had several dinners where we had speakers. But I would not go to Stratford-on-Avon. I just thought that was a complete waste of time, given my proclivities. So
I'm not a giant fan of amusement parks, so I can't see me spending time in Stratford.
Yeah, so I haven't done the Rowe guide, Richard Rowe's guide to Italy yet.
We might have to plan a Shake-Speare Oxford Fellowship tour of Italy, and
might be fun. I think there were some people who did it a couple of years ago. I don't know who, but I remember recalling reading about that on the website. You might want to check that out,
or possibly the quarterly newsletter, perhaps.
Yeah, like I say, I don't know, but I think either somebody did it or was trying to do it, and either wrote about having done it or trying to set it up. I just don't remember.
Well, it's a great opportunity right now to talk about some of the benefits of being a member of this organization. Shake-Speare Oxford Fellowship is a nonprofit organization that anyone is free to join. The dues are relatively inexpensive, and students can join at no cost if they provide proof that they're a student at a college or university. And then that gains them access to the quarterly newsletter, to other publications, to details about events and activities that the organization is putting on, discounts for registration for those events and activities. And so if some of our listeners have been sort of on the fence about taking the plunge and joining the organization, I'd like to take this moment to encourage them. Visit the website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Click on I Want to Join or membership information, and take a look at the levels of membership that are available and give it a test for a year and see if it doesn't enlighten you a little further.
It's really not much. I think that trying to bring in students is one of the best things we can do from a membership expansion point of view, because we need younger people to carry on the search. I also think something else that I don't know whether it just started this year or last year, but if you're a member, you can give a reduced membership to a friend. And I got a fellow I've known for many years who was quite cynical about this whole thing, but started coming to some of the lunches we have here in Washington with me, and he started looking things up. I gave him a membership, reduced membership, as a Christmas or birthday present, something like that. And I think he's going to be renewing because he's really interested in it. So there's lots of ways you can bring people in, and I think expanding the franchise is very important. I really do.
I agree with that. And the last 2 years when I've renewed my membership, I have gifted memberships as well. And I'm going to continue that practice until the day I die. And in fact, I've got a short list forming of people who I'm going to be giving some gift memberships to this year during the holiday season. Whether they like it or not. And I know some of them are not going to like it, but they're going to receive the quarterly newsletter every 3 months anyway. And if they open it up and just browse through it, that's a step closer, because many of them, I know, a part of their resistance is they don't have the time and the energy to really study the issue as thoroughly as you kind of need to really get a grasp and understand it. What would you say is like the best intro from a journalistic standpoint, from your experience as a journalist and a newsman? How would you direct a curious person or one with a curious journalistic mind? How would you direct them to move forward with their pursuit for this truth?
You mean like a book or some kind of reference work?
Or whatever. Like how would you guide them into the authorship question if you had somebody under your wing, for instance?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the field is so vast you can simply drown trying to take it all in. I think if you've got someone, if I were giving somebody guidance and he or she was interested in a play or a poem, I would say to start focusing on that. Now, let's just say, hypothetically, that there's a play. I might look at trying to find. There are a couple of books that
I can hear you rifling through your bookshelf in your office there.
Yeah, but are you losing me?
Yeah, just a little bit, but that's okay. The audience will now understand why.
Yeah, I would find a book that focuses on that play from an Oxfordian perspective. And Hamlet is a perfect example, or A Midsummer Night's Dream. and you have to sort of dip in to some of these enormous volumes. Mark Anderson's book is astonishing. The Man Who Was Shakespeare. You could look at any of the books that Ruth Lloyd Miller reprinted, and focus on Hamlet and see what an Oxfordian says about it. If you look at the traditional books from the Stratfordians, they'll tell you nothing you don't already know. But if you look at the plays through the eyes of an Oxfordian or a skeptic, or simply a non-Stratfordian believer, you suddenly start saying, wait a minute, Hamlet's father died, and then his mother remarries, and Lord Burleigh, who's really famous, takes him under his wing, except he takes all his properties. And how does Ophelia get involved here? And is Burleigh's daughter Anne the eagle? I mean, you start seeing these parallels, and suddenly the scales drop from your eyes. So the short answer is I would dip the toe in a specific place.
I think that's a great suggestion, because if you think about the one thing we all have in common, and I wish that more Stratfordians would understand this about us, was that the one thing we all have in common is our love for the work, our love for the poetry, our love for the characters and the stories that the characters have to tell is mutual. And so I think that's great advice. I think to speak to somebody who is sort of interested or curious or on the fence, as it were, I think pick your favorite play, right, and then read that play from an Oxfordian perspective. And there are several books out there, several versions of the plays that are produced from an Oxfordian perspective with annotations and footnotes that include why it's Oxford's autobiography playing out in front of you. You're right. Anderson's book, Shakespeare by Another Name, does a great job of that. Bill Farina's book as well is great, because it gives you just 3 or 4 pages on each play and why it's Oxford's life in that play. But yeah, that's a great idea and a great piece of advice to those who are listening, who are going, yeah, I'm intrigued by this, but I'm just overwhelmed and I don't know where to start. Start with, if it's A Midsummer Night's Dream that you love, start with A Midsummer Night's Dream. If it's Hamlet that you've always been attached to, go with Hamlet. Lear, go Lear. Whatever one, Macbeth, whatever one is your favorite. And P.S., go look through the list of episodes of this program and you'll find at least 1 or 2 episodes that touch on many of the titles that I just said.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, go small. That's my guidance, because I get overwhelmed, and I'm looking at 6 shelves, 8 shelves full of Oxfordian books and a computer with endless number of digits. I'd go small. There's a book that was published. It's by a woman named Eva Turner Clark, and it really was remarkable. The plates got destroyed during the bombing in London in World War II, and it's not really been reprinted. But I mean, when I would be going to a play for the first time, I'd always sort of check with her book to sort of give me a brief introduction to an Oxfordian take on it, that's another thought. But start small.
No, that's great advice. Now, on the other end of it, what would you say is some of the most compelling evidence for you as a journalist that you would say, okay, here are my 3 sources, Mr. Editor, and that's why I'm sticking to my story?
Well, contemporary works. I mean, Mark Anderson's book is really definitive. I think that Roger Strittmatter's PhD dissertation, which is, I mean, you got to work to get through it, but it's, and I think it's available online. Is a remarkable work. What he did was he took the Bible that was the Geneva Bible, which was owned by Oxford. There was no question that Oxford bought it, or an agent of Oxford bought it, and it was in the Oxford family, and it was never out of the Oxford family. And it has more than 1,000 underlinings in various colored inks, and some of them are, and it's not just like the five books of Moses or the Sermon according to John. Oxford read the Bible, and from cover to cover, and there are things called manticules, which are little images of fingers pointing at something. Well, there's 1,000 instances of fingers pointing at, drawn fingers pointing at something, or underlined words or underlined phrases. And more than 300 of those, or 1/3, show up in the plays and sonnets, and nowhere else. And there are phrases that are simply identical, or words. There's in Merchant of Venice, I think it's the judge, I'm not sure, makes a comment about a flickering flame going out and showing the problems in a naughty, Naughtie, naughty world, bad word, world. But that word naughty appears in the Oxford Bible and nowhere else. So the question is, how did that happen? And you start, seeing things like that, and recognizing that this was a man, Oxford was a man who thought deeply about issues, who may well have been tormented for personal reasons. But you can't hit Shakespeare with anything like this and say, oh, well, here's a note from Will Shakespeare. We didn't write notes. I mean, how many plays in the canon begin with letters, pieces of paper with handwriting on them, going from one person to another that significantly influenced the plot? Well, Romeo and Juliet, for God's sakes, right? I mean, Hamlet.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, where are Shakespeare's letters? Notes, Post-it notes, anything. They don't
Post-it
exist.
notes. Where?
Or whatever.
Where is Post-it notes? Where's his junk mail? Nobody sent him a letter ever in his entire life.
The junk mail, yeah. So, I mean, when you start looking at it from that point of view, you start saying, oh my gosh, there's so much here. And then, frankly, Shakespeare doesn't become this incredibly boring subject that my alma mater, UCLA, doesn't teach anymore. There are a lot of the larger universities, I almost said the great universities, but if you don't teach Shakespeare, you're not a great university. They don't mess around with it anymore. It's too complicated. It's not as, you might suggest it doesn't have 40 characters, but it's wonderful stuff. It's really wonderful stuff, and people are better for reading it and worse for not reading it or seeing it.
I agree with that.
This stuff was all written to be performed, and if you haven't read a play, there's nothing. It's not cheating to see it on YouTube. It's not cheating. And then you want to go back and read, that's fine. But the Elizabethans would have, gone down to the theater, whichever one of the several theaters they went to, and they would see the play. They wouldn't read the play. They would see the play. And that's how you acquire that kind of knowledge.
And right now you can actually access, I believe, pretty much most of the Royal Shakespeare Company's live performances recorded through the National Theatre. They've been offering those up free to people on YouTube through the pandemic. And I think the next one coming right now, this will date this episode, but the next one coming is Coriolanus, I believe. But yeah, great opportunity to see magnificent professionals performing the works. Not always the best. My wife and I have watched a few, and we were so excited about watching Antony and Cleopatra, and we couldn't get past the second act. It just was a bad casting situation.
It happens.
It does. And also sometimes live theater, well, not sometimes, most of the time, live theater just does not translate well to film. A lot of theaters right now, it speaks to my heart because I know so many fellow artists and so many fellow theater people who are going through immense sadness and withdrawals because they haven't been able to get on a stage, and they haven't been able to be in a rehearsal hall with their fellow artists collaborating on work, and they're trying to Zoom performances or do them digitally, and it's just crashing horribly. The London Times, in fact, just recently put out a story where they interviewed some of the top London actors or West End actors who basically have said, this is not theater, and we hate it, and we're not doing this. Let us get back on stage. And so the hope will be that we can do that soon, because I agree with you. It is one of the best ways to consume this work. I think the plays were written specifically to be seen, or in Shakespeare's day, they would say, I'm going to go hear a play. And I think that spoken word was meant to be heard and drummed into the ear in its meter and in its time and in a way that would resound into the brain and be felt in the heart. And it's definitely one of the great pillars of modern Western civilization, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Can't agree with you more.
Well, I hope we can get back to that. Well, before we wrap up today's program, I just wanted to ask you one more question. If you were going to be doing a story about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's works, which 3 sources would you interview first? And I mean, which 3 Elizabethan sources would you interview first?
So these are people alive who are contemporaries, who
are
alive during the 1590s through early 1600s. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Huh.
What sources would you go after?
Am I allowed to mention de Vere?
Well, no, because you can't mention him because he would be the subject of the story, right?
Oh, I see. Okay, I got it. So I would. One person I'd want to interview would be William Golding, who was Oxford's uncle and is the putative translator of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the first time it was translated from Latin into English. Now, Golding was a rather stern, humorless a Protestant minister, or Protestant, and there's a lot of racy stuff in the Metamorphoses that doesn't exactly comport with what's in the original, but might look that way, might look like it had been written by maybe, an over-sexualized 16-year-old. or over-sexualized teenager. So that'd be the first thing I would want to, the first person I would want to interview. I think I would ask Burley. I would want to talk to Oxford's former when Oxford was Burley's ward. What was Burley?
Yeah, basically, I guess he was his guardian. Yeah,
guardian. Okay, let's take the word guardian. So I would want to know. I would want to learn from him. I would want to ask him about Oxford when he was a ward, and then when he cleared his wardship and became independent. What was their relationship like? And I would watch Burley's face. Because
right?
my expectation is that he would seemingly blush a lot. His face would get flushed as the questioning came closer to the question of, well, Lord Burley, exactly how did you accumulate so much money so quickly at the same time that your ward, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, with half a dozen other titles, was endlessly losing his estates, which ended up in your hands? And I would want to ask him about that. And then as a second part of that interview, I would want to know about his precepts. The precepts parallel very, very much Polonius's what can you call it? Pompous statements to Laertes as he's going off. Neither a borrower nor a lender be. But you can find parallels to that in the precepts. The thing is, the precepts were never published, and they were written down, and they were not discovered until after Oxford's death. So how could Oxford have known about them and incorporate them into Hamlet?
Well, you mean
course,
how could any other writer have known about them unless that writer grew up in Burley's home?
That's exactly right. Right.
Sure, I get that.
That would be something.
And one of the things when I've staged that production a couple of times in my life. I've played Hamlet twice, and I've always staged it so that when Polonius is delivering that speech, he kind of gets into his own world, up in his own mind. And here are Laertes and Ophelia on the stage with him. And behind his back, I always have them sort of mimicking him, sort of mocking him as these two children who have heard this speech so many times and have heard him say this so many times, and then I have them complete the line with him when they say neither a borrower nor a lender be. Like, we've heard it, Dad. We've heard it over and over again.
Right. And then the third person I would want to talk to is Susan de Vere. His, I think, beloved daughter, who may well have, after her father's death, collected what became the bulk of the works in the first folio of 1623.
Would you call her? Sorry, but would you call her his Cordelia?
I would ask her whether she sees herself as Cordelia.
Sure.
I would say it sure looks that way to me.
Sure.
But I would want to explore their relationship and have her help me understand their relationship, and also find out what role she played in collecting the manuscripts that eventually got published, dedicated to the two incomparable brethren. And to anybody I talk to about the first folio, I would want to ask a very simple question. And the very simple question is, if these are the works of William Shakespeare, how come Shakespeare's shield, crest, coat of arms wasn't on the volume? Because we know that Shakespeare's father applied for a coat of arms and didn't get it. We know that when Willie went back to Stratford and made some money, he reapplied again in his father's name, and the coat of arms were issued. They were issued with the notation on the original drawing of Shakespeare the player, i.e. actor. And so it meant a lot to him in this upwardly mobile world of the early 17th century. And so I'd want to know, well, how come you didn't put this on the book? Isn't that important? Or were you trying to say Shakespeare had nothing to do with writing the plays? And if those are the only people I'm allowed to question, those are the questions I would ask.
I'd say those are 3 really good interviews that I look forward to having when I walk through the pearly gates and find those folks somewhere in the afterlife. Although I'm not sure Burley might not be on the other side of those gates, the way he acted in life and the things he did. Well, fascinating discussion today, Bob. I want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Sure, my pleasure.
And I hope that our listeners are intrigued enough to maybe even look into the lives of those 3 people that you just mentioned and discover the relationships that they had with Oxford and how that probably informed these works. And, one thing I always will remind people is if you need more information, you can always visit the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. It is your source and resource for everything about the Shakespeare authorship question, and it is added to and updated regularly with new information, new newsletters, new scholarly writings. It's constantly changing as we continue to delve into this intriguing mystery and new things come to light on a regular basis. We also want to remind our audiences that we will definitely love a rate and review wherever you download your podcasts or stream your podcast episodes from. Please be sure to rate and review us. Get us back up there at the top of the page so other people can discover this wonderful mystery. And as always, folks, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.